Hello everyone, welcome back to another edition of Lunchtime Storytime. Today I will be reading from the Frances collection by Russell Hoban with pictures by Lillian Hoban. And today we will be reading Bread and Jam for Frances. And then we will read another chapter of Paddington Bear, as always. Please forgive the fact that I have a stain on my shirt. I spilled my coffee on it. But since I'm home and no one else is here to see me, I'm just going to wear a stained shirt. This is quarantine times and nobody ever has to be perfect. So, with that, I'm going to get a little water. And then we will head into our story. So, this is Bread and Jam for Frances. And this is Frances here. She's a badger. It was breakfast time, and everyone was at the table. Father was eating his egg. Mother was eating her egg. Gloria was sitting in a high chair and eating her egg too. Frances was eating bread and jam. "What a lovely egg," said Father. "If there is one thing I am fond of for breakfast, it is a soft-boiled egg." "Yes," said Mother, spooning up egg for the baby. "It is just the thing to start the day off right." "Ah," said Gloria, and ate up her egg. Frances did not eat her egg. She sang a little song to it. She sang the song very softly. "I do not like the way you slide. I do not like your soft inside. I do not like you lots of ways. And I could go for many days without eggs." "What did you say, Frances?" asked Father. "Nothing," said Frances, spreading jam on another slice of bread. "Why do you keep eating bread and jam?" asked Father, "when you have a lovely soft-boiled egg?" "One of the reasons I like bread and jam," said Frances, "is that it does not slide off your spoon in a funny way." "Well, of course," said Father, "not everyone is fond of soft-boiled eggs for breakfast. But there are other kinds of eggs. There are sunny-side-up and sunny-side-down eggs." "Yes," said Frances, "but sunny-side-up eggs lie on the plate and look at you in a funny way, and sunny-side-down eggs just lie on their stomachs and wait." "What about scrambled eggs?" "Scrambled eggs fall off the fork and roll under the table," said Frances. "I think it is time for you to go to school now," said Mother. Frances picked up the books, her lunchbox, and skipping rope. Then she kissed Mother and Father goodbye and went to the bus stop. While she waited for the bus, she skipped and sang, "Jam on biscuits, jam on toast, jam is the thing that I like most. Jam is sticky, jam is sweet, jam is tasty, jam's a treat. Raspberry, strawberry, gooseberry, I'm very fond of jam." That evening, for dinner, Mother cooked breaded veal cutlets with string beans and baked potatoes. "Ah," said Father, "what is there handsomer on a plate and tastier to eat than breaded veal cutlet?" "It is a nice dish, isn't it?" said Mother. "Eat up the string bean, Gloria." "Oh," said Gloria, and ate it up. She had already eaten her dinner of strained beef and sweet potatoes, but she liked to practice with the string bean when she could. "Where do breaded veal cutlets come from?" asked Frances. "And why are French-cut stringless beans called string beans?" "We can talk about that another time," said Father. "Now it is time to eat our dinner." Frances looked at her plate and sang, "What do cutlets wear before they're breaded? Flannel nightgowns, cowboy boots, furry jackets, sailor suits." Then she spread jam on a slice of bread and took a bite. "She won't try anything new," said Mother to Father. "She just eats bread and jam." "How do you know what you'll like if you won't even try anything?" asked Father. "Well," said Frances, "there are many different things to eat, and they taste many different ways. But when I have bread and jam, I always know what I am getting, and I am always pleased." "You try new things in your school lunches," said Mother. Today I gave you a chicken salad sandwich." "There now," said Father to Frances. "Wasn't it good?" "Well," said Frances, "I traded it to Albert." "For what?" said Father. "Bread and jam," said Frances. The next morning at breakfast, Father sat down and said, "Now I call that a pretty sight. Fresh orange juice and poached eggs on toast. There's a proper breakfast for you." "Thank you for saying so," said Mother. "Poached eggs on toast do have a cheery look, I think." Frances began to sing a poached egg song. "Poached eggs on toast, why do you shiver with such a funny little quiver?" Then she looked down and saw that she did not have a poached egg. "I have no poached egg," said Frances. "I have nothing but orange juice." "I know," said Mother. "Why is that?" said Frances. "Everybody else has a poached egg. Even Gloria has a poached egg, and she is nothing but a baby." "But you do not like eggs," said Mother, "and that is why I did not poach one for you. Have some bread and jam if you are hungry." So Frances ate bread and jam and went to school. When the bell rang for lunch, Frances sat down next to her friend Albert. "What do you have today?" said Frances. "I have a cream cheese, cucumber, and tomato sandwich on rye bread," said Albert, "and a pickle to go with it, and a hard-boiled egg, and a little cardboard shaker of salt to go with that, and a thermos bottle of milk, and a bunch of grapes, and a tangerine, and a cup of custard, and a spoon to eat it with. What do you have?" Frances opened her lunch. "Bread and jam," she said, "and milk." "You're lucky," said Albert. "That's just what you like. You don't have to trade now." "That's right," said Frances. "And I had bread and jam for dinner last night, and for breakfast this morning." "You certainly are lucky," said Albert. "Yes," said Frances, "I am a very lucky girl, I guess. But I'll trade if you want to." "That's all right," said Albert. "I like cream cheese with cucumbers and tomatoes on rye." Albert took 2 napkins from his lunchbox. He tucked one napkin under his chin. He spread the other one on his desk like a tablecloth. He arranged his lunch neatly on the napkin. With his spoon, he cracked the shell of the hard-boiled egg. He peeled away the shell and bit off the end of the egg. He sprinkled salt on the yolk and set the egg down again. He unscrewed his thermos bottle cup and filled it with milk. Then he was ready to eat his lunch. He took a bite of sandwich, a bite of pickle, a bite of hard-boiled egg, and a drink of milk. Then he sprinkled more salt on the egg and went around again. Albert made the sandwich, the pickle, the egg, and the milk come out even. He and his bunch of grapes and his tangerine. Then he cleared away the crumpled up waxed paper, the eggshell, and the tangerine peel. He set the cup of custard in the middle of the napkin on his desk. He took up his spoon and ate up all of the custard. Then Albert folded up his napkins and put them away. He put away the cardboard salt shaker and his spoon. He screwed the cup on top of his thermos bottle, and he shut his lunchbox, put it back inside his desk, and sighed. "I like to have a good lunch," said Albert. Frances ate her bread and jam and drank her milk. Then she went out to the playground and skipped rope. She did not skip as fast as she had skipped in the morning, and she sang, "Jam in the morning, jam at noon, bread and jam by the light of the moon. Jam is very nice." When Frances got home from school, Mother said, "I know you like to have a little snack when you get home from school, and I have one all ready for you." "I do like snacks," said Frances, running to the kitchen. "Here it is," said Mother, "a glass of milk and some nice bread and jam for you." "Aren't you worried that maybe I will get sick and all my teeth will fall out from eating so much bread and jam?" asked Frances. "I don't think that will happen for quite a while," said Mother, "so eat it all up and enjoy it." Frances ate up most of her bread and jam, but she did not eat all of it. After her snack, she went outside to skip rope. Frances skipped a little more slowly than she had skipped at noon, and she sang, Jam for snacks and jam for meals. I know how a jam jar feels, full of jam. That evening for dinner, Mother cooked spaghetti and meatballs with tomato sauce. I am glad to see there will be enough for second helpings, said Father, because spaghetti and meatballs is one of my favorite dishes. Spaghetti and meatballs is a favorite with everybody, said Mother. Try a little spaghetti, Gloria. Said Gloria, and tried the spaghetti. Frances looked down at her plate and saw that there was no spaghetti and meatballs on it. There was a slice of bread and a jar of jam. Frances began to cry. My goodness, said Mother. Frances is crying. What is the matter? Asked Father. Frances looked down at her plate and sang a little sad song. She sang so softly that Mother and Father could scarcely hear her. What I am is tired of jam. I want spaghetti and meatballs, said Frances. May I have some, please? I had no idea you liked spaghetti and meatballs, said Mother. How do you know if I'll like it if you won't even try me? Asked Frances, wiping her eyes. So Mother gave Frances spaghetti and meatballs, and Frances ate it all up. The next day, when the bell rang for lunch, Albert said, What do you have today? Well, said Frances, laying a paper doily on her desk and setting a tiny vase of violets in the middle of it. Let me see. She arranged her lunch on the doily. I have a thermos bottle with cream of tomato soup, she said, and a lobster salad sandwich on thin slices of white bread. I have celery, carrot sticks, and black olives, and a little cardboard shaker of salt for the celery, and 2 plums, and a tiny basket of cherries, and vanilla pudding with chocolate sprinkles, and a spoon to eat it with. That's a good lunch, said Albert. I think it's nice that there are all different kinds of lunches and breakfasts and dinners and snacks. I think eating is nice. So do I, said Frances, and she made the lobster salad sandwich, the celery, the carrot sticks, and the olives come out even. The end. So when I was little, I used to beg my mom to make me lunches, even though I was homeschooled. And she would make fancy lunches just like Frances's, even with a tiny little salt shaker for me. And they were very, very nice. So now we are ready for another chapter of Paddington. And I'm trying to find our chapter. Yes, we are now at chapter 10 of Paddington Bear. And this is Paddington and the Cold Snap. And you can see here, Paddington is all wrapped up for the winter. Paddington and the Cold Snap. Paddington stood on the front doorstep of number 32 Windsor Gardens and sniffed the morning air. He peered out through the gap between his duffel coat hood and a brightly colored scarf that was wound tightly around his neck. On the little that could be seen of his face behind some unusually white-looking whiskers, there was a mixture of surprise and excitement as he took in the sight that met his eyes. Overnight, a great change had come over the weather. Whereas the day before had been mild, almost spring-like for early January, now everything was covered by a thick white blanket of snow that reached almost to the top of his Wellington boots. Not a sound disturbed the morning air. Apart from the clatter of breakfast things in the kitchen, where Mrs. Brown and Mrs. Bird were busy washing up, the only sign that he wasn't alone in the world came from a row of milk bottle tops poking through the snow on the step, and a long trail of footprints where the postman had been earlier that day. Paddington liked snow, but as he gazed at the view in the street outside, he almost agreed with Mrs. Bird, the Browns' housekeeper, that it was possible to have too much of a good thing. Since he'd been living with the Brown family, there had been several of Mrs. Bird's cold snaps, but he couldn't remember ever seeing one before in which the snow had settled quite so deep and crisp and evenly. All the same, Paddington wasn't the sort of bear to waste a good opportunity, and a moment or so later he closed the door behind him and made his way down the side of the house as quickly as he could to investigate the matter. Apart from the prospect of throwing snowballs, he was particularly anxious to test his new Wellington boots, which had been standing in his bedroom waiting for just such a moment ever since Mrs. Brown had given them to him at Christmas. After he reached Mr. Brown's cabbage patch, Paddington busied himself scooping the snow up with his paws and rolling it into firm round balls, which he threw at the clothesline. But after several of the larger ones narrowly missed hitting the next-door greenhouse instead, he hastily turned his attention to the more important task of building a snowman, and gradually peace returned once again to Windsor Gardens. It was some while later, just as he was adding the finishing touches to the snowman's head with some old lemonade bottle tops, that the quiet was suddenly shattered by the sound of a nearby window being flung open. And here we see Paddington outside and building his snowman. "Bear!" came a loud voice. "Is that you, Bear?" Paddington jumped in alarm as he lifted his duffel coat hood and caught sight of the Browns' next-door neighbor leaning out of his bedroom window. Mr. Curry was dressed in pajamas and a dressing gown, and half of his face seemed to be hidden behind a large white handkerchief. "I finished throwing snowballs, Mr. Curry," explained Paddington hastily. "I'm making a snowman instead." To his surprise, Mr. Curry looked unusually friendly as he lifted the handkerchief from his face. "That's all right, Bear," he called in a mild tone of voice. "I wasn't grumbling. I just wondered if you would care to do me a small favour and earn yourself 10 pence bun money into the bargain. I've caught a nasty cold in my nose," he continued, as Paddington climbed up on a box and peered over the fence. "A cold in your nose, Mr. Curry?" repeated Paddington, looking most surprised. He had never heard of anyone having a cold in their nose before, and he stared up at the window with interest. Mr. Curry took a deep breath. "Not doze," he said, swallowing hard and making a great effort. "Nose. And as if that isn't enough, my system is frozen." Paddington became more and more upset as he listened to Mr. Curry, and he nearly fell off his box with alarm at the last piece of information. "Your system's frozen!" he exclaimed. "I'll ask Mrs. Bird to send for Dr. McAndrew." Mr. Curry snorted. "I don't want a doctor, Bear," he said crossly. "I want a plumber. It's not my own pipes that are frozen, it's the water pipes. There isn't even enough left in the tank to fill my hot water bottle." Paddington looked slightly disappointed as a heavy object wrapped in a piece of paper landed at his feet. "That's my front door key," explained Mr. Curry. "I want you to take it along to Mr. James the handyman. Tell him he's to come at once. I shall be in bed, but he can let himself in. And tell him not to make too much noise. I may be asleep. And no hanging round the bun shop on the way, otherwise you won't get your 10 pence. With that, Mr. Curry blew his nose violently several times and slammed his window shut. Mr. Curry was well known in the neighborhood for his meanness. He had a habit of promising people a reward for running his errands, but somehow, whenever the time for payment arrived, he was never to be found. Paddington had a nasty feeling in the back of his mind that this was going to be one of those occasions, and he stood staring up at the empty window for some moments before he turned and made his way slowly in the direction of Mr. James's house. "Curry!" exclaimed Mr. James, as he stood in his doorway and stared down at Paddington. "Did you say Curry?" "That's right, Mr. James," said Paddington, raising his duffel coat hood politely. "His system's frozen, and he can't even fill his hot water bottle." "Hard luck," said the handyman unsympathetically. "I'm having enough trouble with me own pipes this morning, let alone that they are Mr. Curry's. Besides, I know him and his little jobs. He hasn't paid me yet for the last one I did, and that was 6 months ago. Tell him from me, I want to see the colour of his money before I do anything else, and even then I'll have to think twice." Paddington looked most disappointed as he listened to Mr. James. From the little he could remember of Mr. Curry's money, it was usually a very dirty colour, as if it had been kept under lock and key for a long time, and he felt sure Mr. James would be even less keen on doing any jobs if he saw it. "Tell you what," said the handyman, relenting slightly as he caught sight of the expression on Paddington's face. "Hang on. Seeing you've come a long way in the snow, I'll see what I can do to oblige." Mr. James disappeared from view, only to return a moment later carrying a large brown paper parcel. "I'm lending Mr. Curry a blowtorch," he explained, "and I've slipped in a book on plumbing as well. He might find a few tips in it if he gets stuck." "A blowtorch!" exclaimed Paddington, his eyes growing larger and larger. I don't think he'll like that very much. You can take it or leave it, said Mr. James. It's all the same to me. But if you want my advice, Bear, you'll take it. This weather's going to get a lot worse before it gets any better. So saying, Mr. James bade a final good morning and closed his door firmly, leaving Paddington standing on the step with a very worried expression on his face as he stared down at the parcel in his paws. Mr. Curry didn't have a very good temper at the best of times, and the thought of waking him in order to hand over a blowtorch or even a book on plumbing, especially when he had a bad cold, filled Paddington with alarm. Paddington's face grew longer and longer the more he thought about it, but by the time he turned to make his way back to Windsor Gardens, his whiskers were so well covered by flakes that only the closest passer-by would have noticed anything amiss. Mrs. Brown paused in her housework as the small figure hurried past the kitchen window. "I suppose," she said with a sigh, "we can look forward to paw prints all over the house for the next few days." "If this weather keeps up, that bear'll have to watch more than his paws," said Mrs. Bird as she joined her. "He'll have to mind his P's and Q's as well." The Browns' housekeeper held very strict views on the subject of dirty floors, particularly when they were the result of Bear's goings-on in the snow, and she followed Paddington's progress into Mr. Brown's garage with a disapproving look. "I think he must be helping out next door," said Mrs. Brown as Paddington came into view again, clutching something beneath his duffel coat. "It sounds as if Mr. Curry's having trouble with his pipes." "I hope that's all he's having trouble with," said Mrs. Bird. "There's been far too much hurrying about this morning for my liking." Mrs. Bird was never very happy when Paddington helped out, and several times she'd caught sight of him going past the kitchen window with what looked suspiciously like pieces of old piping sticking out of his duffel coat. Even as she spoke, a renewed burst of hammering came from the direction of Mr. Curry's bathroom and echoed round the space between the two houses. First, there were one or two bangs, then a whole series that grew louder and louder, finally ending in a loud crash and a period of silence broken only by the steady hiss of a blowtorch. "If it sounds like that in here," said Mrs. Brown, "goodness only knows what it must be like next door." "It isn't what it sounds like," replied Mrs. Bird grimly. "It's what it looks like that worries me." The Browns' housekeeper left the window and began busying herself at the stove. Mrs. Bird was a great believer in letting people get on with their own work, and the activities of Mr. Curry's plumber were no concern of hers. All the same, had she waited a moment longer, she might have changed her views on the matter, for at that moment the window of Mr. Curry's bathroom opened, and a familiar-looking hat, followed by some equally familiar whiskers, came into view. From the expression on his face as he leaned over the window-sill and peered at the ground far below, it looked very much as if Paddington would have been the first to agree with Mrs. Bird's remarks on the subject. Paddington was an optimistic bear at heart, but as he clambered back down from the window and viewed Mr. Curry's bathroom, even he had to admit to himself that things were in a bit of a mess. In fact, taking things all around, he was beginning to wish he'd never started on the job in the first place. Apart from Mr. James's blowtorch and a large number of tools from Mr. Brown's garage, the floor was strewn with odd lengths of pipe, pieces of solder, and several saucepans, not to mention a length of hosepipe that he'd brought up from the garden in case of an emergency. But it wasn't so much the general clutter that caused Paddington's gloomy expression as it was the amount of water that lay everywhere. In fact, considering that the pipes had been completely frozen when he'd started, he found it hard to understand where it had all come from. The only place in the whole of the bathroom where there wasn't some kind of pool was in a corner by the wash basin, where he had placed one of his Wellington boots beneath a leaking pipe, in the hope of getting enough water to fill Mr. Curry's hot water bottle. Paddington was particularly anxious to fill the bottle before Mr. Curry took it into his head to get up. Already there had been several signs of stirring from the direction of his bedroom, and twice a loud voice had called out, demanding to know what was going on. Both times, Paddington had done his best to make a deep grunting noise like a plumber hard at work, and each time Mr. Curry's voice had grown more suspicious. Paddington hastily began scooping water off the floor with his paw to help matters along, but as fast as he scooped the water up, it soaked into his fur and ran back up his arm. Hopefully squeezing a few drops from his elbow into the Wellington boot, Paddington gave a deep sigh and turned his attention to the book Mr. James had lent him. The book was called The Plumber's Aid by Bert Stilson, and although Paddington felt sure it was very good for anyone who wanted to fit pipes in their house for the first time, there didn't seem to be a great deal on what to do once they were in and frozen hard. Mr. Stilson seemed to be unusually lucky with the weather whenever he did a job, for in nearly all the photographs it was possible to see the sun shining through the open windows. There was only one chapter on frozen pipes, and in the picture that went with it, Mr. Stilson was shown wrapping them in towels soaked in boiling water. With no water to boil, Paddington had tried holding Mr. Curry's one and only towel near the blowtorch in order to warm it, but after several, rather nasty brown patches suddenly appeared, he'd hastily given it up as a bad job. Another picture showed Mr. Stilson playing the flame of a blowtorch along a pipe as he dealt with a particularly difficult job, and Paddington had found this method much more successful. The only trouble was that as soon as the ice inside the pipe began to melt, a leak appeared near one of the joints. Paddington tried stopping the leak with his paw while he read to the end of the chapter, but on the subject of leaking pipes, Mr. Stilson was even less helpful than he had been on frozen ones. In a note about lead pipes, he mentioned hitting them with a hammer in order to close the gap, but whenever Paddington hit one of Mr. Curry's gaps, at least one other leak appeared farther along the pipe, so that instead of the one he'd started with, there were now 5, and he had run out of paws. For some while, the quiet of the bathroom was broken only by the hiss of the blowtorch and the steady drip, drip, drip of water as Paddington sat lost in thought. Suddenly, as he turned over a page near the end of the book, his face brightened. Right at the end of the very last chapter, Mr. Stilson had drawn a chart which he'd labeled Likely Trouble Spots. Hurriedly unfolding the paper, Paddington spread it over the bathroom stool and began studying it with interest. According to Mr. Stilson, most things to do with plumbing caused trouble at some time or another, but if there was one place which was more troublesome than all the others put together, it was where there was a bend in the pipe. At the bottom of the chart, Mr. Stilson explained that bends shaped like the letter U always had water inside them, and so they were the very first places to freeze when the cold weather came. Looking around Mr. Curry's bathroom, Paddington was surprised to see how many U-bends there were. In fact, wherever he looked, there appeared to be a bend of one kind or another. Holding Mr. Stilson's book in one paw, Paddington picked up the blowtorch in the other and settled himself underneath the wash basin, where one of the pipes made itself into a particular large U shape before it entered the cold tap. As he played the flame along the pipe, sitting well back in case he accidentally singed his whiskers, Paddington was pleased to hear several small cracking noises coming from somewhere inside. In a matter of moments, the crackles were replaced by bangs, and his opinion of Mr. Stilson went up by leaps and bounds as almost immediately afterwards a loud gurgling sound came from the basin over his head, and the water began to flow. Here's Paddington reading his book and watching the pipe. To make doubly sure of matters, Paddington stood up and ran the blowtorch flame along the length of the pipe with one final sweep of his paw. It was, as he did so, that the pleased expression on his face suddenly froze, almost as solidly as the water in Mr. Curry's pipes had been frozen just a second before. Everything happened so quickly that it all seemed to be over in the blink of an eyelid, but one moment he was standing under the basin with a blowtorch, and the next moment there was a hiss and a loud plop, and before his astonished gaze, Mr. Curry's U-bend disappeared into thin air. Paddington just had time to take in the pool of molten lead on the bathroom floor before a gush of cold water hit him on the chin, nearly bowling him over. Here is Paddington with a problem. Acting with great presence of mind, he knocked the hot, flexible remains of the pipe and turned it back into Mr. Curry's bath, leaving the water to hiss and gurgle as he turned to consult Mr. Stilson's book once more. There was a note somewhere near the back telling what to do in cases of emergency that he was particularly anxious to read. A few seconds later, he hurried downstairs as fast as his legs would carry him, slamming the front door in his haste. Almost at the same moment as it banged shut, there came the sound of a window being opened somewhere overhead, and Mr. Curry's voice rang out. "Bear!" he roared. "What's going on, Bear?" "You're having trouble with your U-bends, Mr. Curry," cried Paddington. "Round the bend?" spluttered Mr. Curry. "Did I hear you say I'm round the bend?" Mr. Curry took a deep breath as he prepared to let forth on the subject of bears in general, and Paddington in particular, but as he did so, a strange look came over his face, and before Paddington's astonished gaze, he began dancing up and down, waving his arms in the air. "Where's all this water coming from, Bear?" he roared. "I've got ice-cold water all over my feet. Where's it all coming from?" But if Mr. Curry was expecting an answer to his question, he was unlucky, for a second later the sound of another front door being slammed punctuated his remarks, only this time it was the door belonging to number 32. Paddington had been thinking for some while that he'd had enough of plumbing for one day, and the expression on Mr. Curry's face quite decided him in the matter. Mr. Brown looked up from his morning paper as a burst of hammering shook the dining room. "I shall be glad when they've finished next door," he said. "They've been at it for days now. What on earth's going on?" "I don't know," said Mrs. Brown as she poured out the coffee. "Mr. Curry's got the builders in. I think it's something to do with his bathroom. He's been acting strangely all week. He came round specially the other evening to give Paddington 10p." "Mr. Curry gave Paddington 10p," echoed Mr. Brown, lowering his paper. "I think he had a nasty accident during the cold weather," said Mrs. Bird. "He's having a complete new bathroom paid for by the insurance company." "Trust Mr. Curry to get it done for nothing," said Mr. Brown. "Whenever I try to claim anything from my insurance company, there's always a clause in small print at the bottom telling me I can't." "Oh," said Mrs. Bird. "I have a feeling this was more of a pause than a clause. It's what Mr. Curry calls an act of bear." "An act of bear?" repeated Mr. Brown. "I've never heard of that one before." "It's very rare," said Mrs. Bird. "Very rare indeed. In fact, it's so rare I don't think we shall hear of it again. Do you, Paddington?" The Browns turned towards Paddington, or what little could be seen of him from behind a large jar of his special marmalade from the cut-price grocer in the market, but the only sound to greet them was that of crunching toast as he busied himself with his breakfast. Paddington could be very hard of hearing when he chose. All the same, there was a look about him suggesting that Mrs. Bird was right, and that as far as one member of the household was concerned, bathrooms were safe from acts of bear for many winters to come. And that is the end of the chapter. I hope you have enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow I will not be reading because tomorrow is Saturday, but I will be back on Monday around lunchtime with more stories. So enjoy your weekend. If it is sunny outside, try and go for a walk or do something fun, and I will see you on Monday. Bye!